My name is Nancy Smith, and I direct the Center on Victimization and Safety at the Vera Institute of Justice. I have been with Vera for the past 13 years, and I've been working in the area of violence against people with disabilities and deaf people for the past 15 years.
Hello, my name is Erin Esposito. I am the Executive Director of Advocacy Services for Abused Deaf Victims, ASADV. We're based in Rochester, New York.
Back in 2005, we began working with the U.S. Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women to look at ways to enhance the work that they were doing to improve services for people with disabilities. And one of our first questions was to look at why there were not many deaf-focused projects through the Department of Justice. And we went on a journey to understand that, and we started by talking to deaf advocates across the country. And the first thing we learned was that many deaf people do not identify as having a disability and instead identify as being members of a cultural and linguistic group, and therefore didn't feel as though the work that was being done to address abuse of people with disabilities resonated with them, or that they were a part of that. And so at that point in time, we decided to work specifically with the deaf community to support the work that was being done to address the needs of deaf survivors. And we've had the opportunity over the past 8 years to work with many deaf advocates and also to work on the ground in communities across the country to improve services for deaf survivors. And we wanted a way to take the lessons learned from the work that's being done across the country to a much larger audience. And we thought that this publication was a great way to raise awareness about the needs of deaf survivors.
Abusers use many different strategies and tactics to control their survivor, the person they're living with, their significant other. Within the deaf community, there are deaf abusers and deaf survivors. Maybe the abuser is a hearing person. It just depends on the situation. Just for example, people who are living with a hearing person, that deaf person experiences a lot of autism. That's the definition of autism is hearing privilege. They can easily oppress other people who communicate via sign language because they can hear and speak. And for example, just to clarify a bit, there was a time when a deaf woman called 911. She wanted police to come to help in her residence because her ex-husband was causing problems, and he was very abusive. And the police cars arrived at the home. Now, just to clarify, the survivor is female and deaf. The abuser is hearing and male. The police arrived, they checked out the scene, and the woman was very emotional and visibly upset. The man was very calm and collected and spoke in a very calm manner, was very jovial and kind with police and explained the situation and said, you know, my wife is very emotional person. She has some mental issues. So the police spent all their time just telling her to calm down, calm down, calm down. They didn't communicate with her directly at all. They didn't allow her to share any information about her situation. So that's an example of the use of hearing privilege. And that's a popular tactic that abusers use with deaf survivors.
The research on violence against deaf people is emerging, and the emerging research points to the fact that deaf people experience domestic and sexual violence at rates higher than their hearing counterparts. But the research is actually very limited. There really isn't any ongoing national data collection efforts that would allow us to say with certainty how much higher the rates of domestic and sexual violence are against people who are deaf. Many of the efforts that are being done in terms of research focus on people with disabilities, and they have not really disentangled the deaf community from that research, and also don't use a cultural and linguistic lens to understand the experiences of deaf survivors. As I mentioned, though, the emerging research does show an increase, and there are a couple studies that are just being released that show that deaf people experience domestic and sexual violence at rates anywhere between 1.5 times or 2 times greater than their hearing counterparts.
Related to barriers to deaf people and what deaf people face after they experience domestic violence and sexual violence, the list could go on and on. There's a myriad of issues, but the top issue and barrier and challenge we need to overcome is communication and language access. It's paramount. It is everywhere, all over the United States. It's a consistent barrier for our deaf community members. It's a message that we need to share with people again and again. For example, when you go into court, if a deaf person wants to apply for an order of protection against their abuser, they fill out the paperwork, they go into court. Often the deaf person arrives and they have to sit and wait for an hour, maybe 2 hours. Sometimes they have waited for as long as 3 hours for an interpreter to arrive into court. So by the time the interpreter arrives, they have to go through that entire process to get the order of protection. They have to have the interview, they sit in the waiting room, they talk to the judge. The entire process can eat up an entire day or 2 days. They'll get to the end of the day and they'll be told, I'm sorry, you need to come back another day. So then they think, you know what, I'm better off just staying with the abuser than going back to court and staying in that hopeless, frustrating place where they can't communicate.
So we have had the opportunity to work with many deaf advocates across the country who are working in communities to close gaps for deaf survivors, and we have learned a tremendous amount from those deaf advocates in terms of the needs of deaf survivors, and we wanted to take the lessons learned to a much broader audience. And so our hope through this publication is to provide an understanding of the needs of deaf survivors through a cultural and linguistic lens, and to begin to raise awareness about the barriers that deaf survivors face, and also to offer some very practical steps that hearing policymakers and practitioners can take to help close the gaps that deaf survivors face.
The publication is amazing. It's one of the most powerful papers that I've seen on the topic of survivors within the deaf community in a long time, and it's very needed. It's hugely valuable. The resources in it are rich. It's very, very clearly written. It identifies the challenges one by one, and it talks about the issues that deaf survivors face, and it provides strategies how we can solve these issues together. It has a very clear point to it, and it provides a myriad of resources as well.
Culture, language, and access, key considerations for serving deaf survivors of domestic and sexual violence.